Good morning. My name is Jamie Waterfield, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for the third and final in a series of panel discussions brought to you by Apex Digital Solutions. Throughout this series, we've spoken with experts across managed security solutions, incident response and recovery, legal, and insurance on advice before, during, and after a security breach. All sessions are being recorded, so you can go back and watch any that are missed on our YouTube channel. Our host for today's panel discussion is Apex Digital Solutions founder and CEO, Jason Lamberis. We wish to welcome back and thank our panelists joining us today who each bring a significant amount of experience in their respective fields of work. Sean Blankhorn, Senior Security Advisor to Apex Digital Solutions. Stephen Legg, co-founder and CEO of Antigen Security. Chris Martella, shareholder with Kemp Klein Law Firm. And Brian Pilarski, commercial insurance agent with Brown & Brown in Detroit. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Jamie. First, want to start out and just for those that have joined us in the first two series, want to thank you or welcome you back. And for those that are just joining us for this part, as Jamie mentioned, be sure to check out the first and second part. And thank you for taking some time today. So as we've been discussing across this three-part series, I wanted to chat a little bit about kind of the aftermath, so to speak. As we had shared some of the statistics in the previous series, you know, the average life cycle of a breach is upwards of 315 days. 228 days of that sometimes just is what it takes to identify that a breach has occurred. And then, you know, the remainder of that 80 roughly days is what it typically takes to contain it. Importantly to note, right, that the more that you can reduce that overall life cycle, the less it is going to cost your organization in the end. So starting out, right, it's a little bit of a gray area, I think. So, you know, how do we know specifically when we've kind of reached that milestone in containment that we're all clear, so to speak, or can kind of come off of DEFCON 1 depending on the scenario that you're in? So to first kind of set the stage for that, right, of kind of shifting into the aftermath, I'm going to go to Stephen Legg. And Stephen, can you maybe share with our viewers from your perspective, kind of what maybe some of the activities that we are doing or kind of what that looks like and feels like in various scenarios?
Yeah, sure. So obviously the specifics of time frame and measurement will depend on the exact type of breach, right? A ransomware is going to look and feel different from a business email compromise, for example. But generally speaking, talking broadly first, going through that kind of like final walk, all clear, the waiting period, really that comes down to a few things. It means that you have remediated or removed all of the malicious software or foothold that was created by the attacker that you're aware of, and that you are no longer observing through your security tools and technologies any further activity for a period of time. Key to that, though, too, is making sure that you are looking at and following your incident response plan to evaluate all the places that could show up, right? You know, for a business email compromise, it could mean things like making sure that everyone has been, has enabled multi-factor authentication and changed their passwords and kind of restored things back to a point of authority. Whereas on more of a ransomware perspective, you're talking about reestablishing a secure and contained operating environment that is controlled solely by the organization. And having gone over that and recovered and restored operations while maintaining those forensic artifacts as appropriate on the back end. So it can be a little bit different depending on each scenario, but those are the general outcomes that you're looking for. You want to make sure that you've got all of the attacker activity that was observable addressed. You've removed all the malicious software and bad things that are going on. And now you have validated that all clear is true, and you've waited 24 to 48 hours. You're following the advice of your incident response team and your technical people, and you've got that firm thumbs up after that.
When we move over to Chris, right? So Chris, kind of leading up to the, and again, we know this is a little bit of a scenario dependent. What are some of the things that we can expect as we kind of reach that milestone and then start to get into those next stages from a legal perspective, or things that you've seen in cases you've been involved in?
So from a legal perspective, predominantly what we see the all clear is there is a report. If you brought your insurance provider in, or you brought a company in like Antigen, a third party to oversee the data breach mitigation and the post-breach issues, you're usually looking for some sort of documentation, either a post-breach report, a letter from your insurance provider. As I'm very, very familiar in my industry, and what I see is the following. Usually after the IT people have gone through, done their post-breach issue, done their mitigation, done their testing, and their certification, they present a report. And it can be something as it can be a multi-page formal report that talks about the breach, what measures were taken during the breach, and then its cleanup, as well as what they might, some recommendations going forward. But there's usually a report, and it's multi-page, and it can cover a number of things, and that's presented to the insurance provider and to the company. That is usually when my world, the clock starts ticking from the end date, when you have to talk about keeping documents and when your liability is out there. But that letter or that correspondence, either from the insurance company or from someone the insurance company brought in or your own IT people, that document or that set of documents is usually ground zero or the 0 day, more jokingly, the 0 day going forward, for calculation purposes from the legal standpoint. There isn't, unlike some of the other people on this, we're not entrenched, lawyers aren't entrenched in what's going on during the breach as much. We are there kind of at the end saying, okay, everyone's done, everyone's completed what their tasks were, the report has been published, legal has seen it, insurance company has seen it, client has seen it. That's the point. That's the end date. And again, Stephen, I know you're familiar with producing those reports. Jason, you and I personally have gone through and seen those reports. And Brian, every insurance company I know has a little different report or a little different requirement. Which is my caveat to this when they say takeaway. Make sure you are getting that end of breach report from your insurance provider, from your post-breach team. That is very important to use. That's a takeaway. Don't think it's over until you have that documentation in your hands. And it will be a report. There will be some work product there. It won't be just a simple email saying, hey, we're done. Yay, team, go. It's going to be a report. And make sure you have that and keep that for at least 6 years, by the way, if not longer.
So why don't we dive a little bit further into that, right? So we're saying we definitely need this documentation, we need this report. Let's go to Brian next, right? So Brian, kind of from an insurance provider standpoint or from your chair, what are the key things that you in particular might be looking for to kind of hit this milestone before we're dealing with the next stages?
Yeah, Chris hit it on the head. Somebody like Antigen would offer some type of information technology, a forensic type of report to document what happened and what's in work, kind of all clear. And the insurance really is, money. That's what it is. And what they're looking to do is pay out the additional bills and invoices and expenses that are covered and that, are seeking reimbursement. There might be certain services that have been performed, have not yet been billed yet. So they'll wait for those invoices. They'll refer to the report that Chris was talking about, produced by somebody like Antigen. And then they'll also look at any other, monitoring and liability responsibilities they might have for, maybe personal information that could be subject to some type of review. So we mentioned the California Consumer Protection Act and GDRP over in Europe. And, there are 46 states or 47 states within the United States that have their own breach notification requirements and notification. So there could be some tail activity paying for some of those notification costs. So the insurance company will, again, look at expenses, reimburse it. Some insurance policies will give you betterment coverage. So part of the report that Chris mentioned, maybe for certain improvements. So the insurance company would review the cost to implement those. And believe it or not, the insurance company will pay for that, which is a newer twist to the insurance world. Insurance typically, on a side note, would just put you back to where you were before you started. So to have insurance that would actually better you is a little bit contrary to the true nature of it. So in cyber in particular, they know that what systems were in there may not be adequate, or things evolve and change so much that it may not be available in the marketplace anymore. So to wrap up this point, it really is taking care of expenses and making sure all the future liabilities are accounted for. Then they will officially close the claim, and the document they will give a final closure of the claim, that the claim is officially closed, and that if something else changes, let them know. Here's the claim number for future reference. But you will have an official letter that all expenses have been paid. There's no additional liability. This matter is closed, and there'll be a document to mark that.
Okay, very good. Now, I'm gonna go to Sean here next, right? So Sean, similar kind of question. So obviously we need the reports, we need the documentation. That stuff needs to be provided to the various legal parties, as well as insurance providers. And I think this is probably, kind of bouncing between you and Steven. From an internal organization perspective or internal IT team, or I'll ask, what should those organizations be looking for from their providers, right? What are the things that we should also have either documentation on? What should we be checking the box on to kind of reach the closure, or to say, okay, we're contained at this point?
Yeah, and I think Stephen mentioned it. The reality is there's going to be differing timelines based on the type of event that happened, and I think also what you should expect from the provider will differ a little bit based on the type of incident that you had. But generally speaking, you're going to want that report Brian mentioned, but that forensics report that kind of details what has been found throughout the incident, how the incident occurred, some sort of root cause analysis as part of that to make a determining fact decision, and to give the leadership the comfort of knowing, okay, they've done what's necessary to block the activity further. So you want that from your IR provider. You also want that review completed, and any steps or mitigation steps taken by, if you have an IT provider. So whether that's an internal team or a third-party team that you outsource to, you want to make sure that you've put in any mitigation around those. So additional, whether that's additional technical controls or anything else to prevent further, infection or spread or anything else. So how you respond to that will depend on, the outcome of that incident response activity. But you want that third-party provider or your internal IT team to have taken the steps necessary to prevent reinfection or anything else. And then I would say, my expectation would be on the IT security team, again, whether that's internal or third party, some sort of plan for continued monitoring, heightened monitoring. So you talked about, Jason, being at DEFCON 1. You accelerate, pretty quickly in that type of scenario to get to DEFCON 1. You don't want to, completely take your foot off that pedal. You want to ease back into normal operations, meaning you may have a longer tail in terms of extra monitoring that you didn't typically have before. Excuse me. So you want to have a plan with your provider for that, again, whether internal or external. So those are all keys for me when I think about how to give the leadership team that comfort of being able to sleep at night.
Good.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Sean. You touched on a couple points, and you started to talk about service providers. When dealing with service providers and speaking from the perspective of a company that puts out these reports, there are going to be reports along the way or data collected along the way that you're going to disseminate and review in the appropriate circles within your organization. And those things should absolutely be, like, for example, a breach that involves a service provider that is managing infrastructure or has some kind of control over parts of your environment. You're going to want official reports from them on what they observed. You're going to want to understand kind of the timeline of events practiced by their staff. You're going to want to understand what they did to remediate and how they aided in containment. Those things should align with your the SLA requirements and terms of your contract with those organizations, and that is also a metric that matters to you as an internal organization dealing with breaches, with third parties involved. But those things along the way will inform a lot of what Sean's talking about. Those parties and your IR provider should be identifying the vulnerabilities that led to the breach. They should know what things were exploited to get there, and to the degree that it's possible to fully discover that, be able to use that information to validate through the security tools and mechanisms in place that all clear is truly legitimate for that reason. And when I was talking about that, I was talking more from a technologist perspective and less from the legal perspective. But it all kind of comes together in those pieces of communication with your third parties.
Very good.
I was going to say, Jason, if you let me, Stephen, to your point, from the legal side of it, the company that has been breached, you are the gatekeeper of the information. All the information will flow through to you. So from the legal standpoint, Stephen is spot on. The company, or your CIO or your team are the ones that have to actually assemble all the data and store it and parse through it as well, because you might get this report at the end and it might not cover X, Y, and Z, or there might be something post-breach mitigation issue that you have to deal with, or notification. It falls on you as the company now to actually withhold and control that information and understand it. Just because you got it and you put it in a mothballed and put it in a box on the shelf is not enough. You do have an obligation to understand what you've received and what your obligations are, because Brian will confirm this. The insurance company will do what it's supposed to do, and that's as far as it goes. If there's something else that comes up and you have to go back to them on that claim, you're the one that has to have that information. So remember, as the CIO, the COO, whatever IT infrastructure you have and leadership you have, that group of people or person is the gatekeeper of that information, and it must maintain data. So we talk about post-breach, we talk about what's done at the end. Holding onto that data and understanding it is extremely important. Having that conversation with your providers, calling up Stephen and saying, hey, I don't understand this report, or this doesn't make any sense. You said A, B, and C. It's on you to understand it, not Brian, your insurance, your arm, and definitely not your lawyers until you bring them involved. So you guys have to remember that as management and internal company management. So I will digress, because Stephen, you led me into that perfectly. Thank you.
Well, it's a much appreciated point, Chris, because I think it one of it was either part one or part two. We'd share that when it comes to the cost of this, 30% of the actual cost of the breach could come upwards of a year after containment, right? So I think very important of knowing then kind of what the obligations are, which perfect segue into really kind of the next topic or subtopic of this, right? So once we've reached this milestone, right, we've all said it's a little bit gray depending on the scenario, right? But we're starting to, as Sean put it eloquently, kind of let off that throttle a little bit. Maybe we've got a little productive paranoia to make sure that we're still watching our 6 o'clock on things. But now that we've reached kind of that threshold, if you will, I'm going to come back to Stephen and say, what are the things, Stephen, that we should, organizations should be either don't doing, be aware of, right? Kind of that aftermath piece. What do those steps look like?
So I think the really important one that I'll start with and talk about, and really this isn't, you shouldn't think of this as a one time or one and done kind of a thing. You should be, after you've come past that initial, like you're still in DEFCON 1, right? You're still on heightened alert, you're still hyper vigilant. But once you have passed that all clear point and your IR and security teams are telling you, hey, we're not seeing anything else. It looks like we've remediated everything initially. Here's kind of our inventory and collection of what we found to date. Let's talk about that. That post-breach or post-incident review and post-mortem discussion is really critical. Starting to break down the key metrics that matter. How long did it take us to acknowledge? How long did it take us to contain? How long did it take us to recover? Did we meet all our SLAs for our relationships and obligations? Did our providers meet their SLAs? Did we report and capture everything in our communication and documentation along the way? Have we identified and remediated all the mechanisms, closed all the doors that the criminals used to get in and cause the damage? Have we fully addressed the damage? Talking about these things actively, and then circling back to that at key points. Chris, you outlined several of them. When you get that IR report, when you get a better understanding of kind of the data disclosure and notifications you have to put out to the affected parties, having those active review discussions and discussing both the impact, the actions required to execute on that, as well as pointers and improvements for the future to avoid that. Those discussions are really the kind of key jumping off point to bettering your security and hardening up after an incident around the things that led to it and preventing reinfection, right?
All good points, and you'd said from a metric standpoint, right? That kind of helps us hone a few things and understand through that post-mortem, if you will, right? What wasn't in our plan and what came up that we might need to be concerned about or consider for the future in different scenarios. So I'm going to go to Brian next, right? So Brian, kind of after the scenario, what can people we talked a little bit about what they should be doing, right? But from an insurance perspective, maybe using some of the advice that Stephen had shared there. What kind of conversation should they be having? What can they expect if there is a secondary incident later on down the road? What do you kind of commonly see happening in that aftermath, if you will?
Yeah, it's hard to say because it varies so much, by individual, by the type of incident happening and how things are progressing. But one of the things that I implore people to do is continue to over communicate with the insurance company about what's going on. A lot of times, you talked about accelerating to the response, and then now we're kind of backing down, and there's somewhat of an operational thing going on. There are a lot of things thrown at the business owner or IT team, and there are a lot of requests for additional work or payments to be made or purchases to be made or other decisions as they're some of that assessment you guys are talking about. As you look back, did we do the right things? What do the metrics look like? And people they have the right intention to really do the best they can. They want to make the most improvements. If insurance is involved, they need to be aware of what decisions are in front of that business owner and what they're looking to pay for. So, so my point on over communication is, as invoices or suggestions are being made before they're approved or said yes on, have them reviewed by the insurance company. They often have a different view, as Chris alluded to earlier, and is that they're looking at maybe the minimum required by their contract, and that's it. And so I think it's important for businesses to know, as they're looking to improve on some of the things that went on during the breach event or issue, what is covered, what is not. And they can make the determination of the spend based on the advice from the rest of their team. But insurance is not going to say, okay, send us the receipt for everything you paid for. And I think people are disappointed by that at certain times. And things we talked about in the other two series or conversations were not every insurance policy is created equally. There are a lot of variation on what they will and will not cover. So again, the pressure on the insurance company in my arm in this is, we want this stuff covered. We want them to pay for it all. There are a lot of opportunities for a lot of expenses to be reimbursed or paid for directly. You just have to let them know what's going on incrementally, allow them the chance to review it and or approve it. Is the best advice I give during this kind of post-mortem reassessment and kind of repair phase that they're in.
So Brian, I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit because I want to dive a little bit deeper into that, right? So, in all the cases and incidents that you've been involved in, fortunately or unfortunately, I guess depending on the perspective there, looking back at policies, and I think it was in part one, right? Chris had very much advised, hey, there's coverage and then there's good coverage, right? So this is part of the review that we're supposed to be doing in that planning stage. What are the things that you see, if there are common ones, and it may differ by industry, company size, but what are the common things you see that people just were not either anticipating from a cost standpoint or just had inadequate coverage from, or inadequate coverage for?
Great question. I can jokingly say any client of mine has all they need, right? But I'm being facetious there. There are clients that choose not to buy it, or they buy a minimal amount for different reasons, and there's all various reasons, and there's no judgment on that. It's all a decision on risk and risk transfer and risk mitigation. But most commonly, we see organizations where they lack sufficient coverage is on that first party expense, which is their own expenses for these type of events. We typically don't see adequate business interruption coverage at all. We don't see extra expense coverage tied to that's tied to a breach event. We often don't see electronic data in the recovery time for that as being a covered expense. So there's notification we see is also not covered. And some of these additional expenses around just managing this. Again, the betterment is another component of it where that's becoming more and more common, but it's not widely purchased at this point. Whereas the insurance company will have money, as I mentioned earlier, for buying improved systems or upgraded servers or other types of security measures that may need to be implemented. That's often not part of the policies now. And the last thing that's usually not part of the policies is the breaking effect of a breach event, where a lot of automated equipment or smart systems, the IoT version of whatever business that is, they may render or damage the firmware of a product or other components that talk in some type of system. And so because that hardware or firmware is now toast, that product itself, property insurance market doesn't cover that. That's more pushed towards a cyber policy. So again, we don't see a lot of business owners that have cyber. We don't see their policies typically contemplate actual damage to the product itself, physical damage. So, to cap that, business interruption, your expense in betterment coverage, and then also, the hard tangible property loss because of firmware damage. Think of an iPhone. It's a $1,200 piece of equipment, and if something happens, some malware is on there and it's useless, to pay for the iPhone, a cyber policy needs to be specifically endorsed to pay for it.
Yep. Right. So really trying to think holistically ahead of time, right, about what those possibilities and needs would be from a time, money, and resource standpoint, including internal. Great point. Chris, I'm sure you've had to be on the side of advocating from time to time for your clients. So any kind of additional thoughts or considerations in that vein of, hey, anticipate this or think about these things and kind of the do's and don'ts?
Yeah, absolutely. One, Brian, you teed it up for me almost perfectly when you talked about IoT and firmware and hardware and internal software on manufacturing equipment. This is Detroit, this is a common issue, and not having coverage for it. One of the big things that has been brought up that is very important to discuss is when you look at who's picking up the tab and how things are getting paid for. Of course, work with your insurance company to make sure you have backup, you have funding. Okay, you're getting paid for what you're doing, but also take it one step further and review your service agreements. Review your contracts, your vendor contracts, because there may be language in there that covers damage to equipment. We're going to use, let's say, a CAD machine or a manufacturing piece of equipment that has internal firmware and hard drives. There actually may be a way to loop it in or coverage under your contract with that vendor to say, you got to repair that Xerox printer, or you have to repair that Forcia arm. So understand that there are multiple sources of potential coverage that isn't insurance that may help you as the breach party or the damaged party to go to a vendor, to go to your service providers and say, hey, this kind of repair or this kind of issue, you're indemnifying us for that. You didn't know that, but now it's your responsibility to fix it. And that's something else that your insurance company is more than likely not going to advise you on. They're not going to do that legwork for you. That is something you, like data retention and coordinating your service providers, falls on the company or the breach party. So when we talk about what to do after the fact, how to cover your behind after the fact, that's a real important one. Look at your contracts, look what's in place. And that is also a way that's a cheap, non-expensive betterment function you can do as well. When you look at your contracts, you can say, listen, this breach happened. Next time we're up for renewal on fill in the blank, we got to make sure that this is covered. So we discuss this in the contract, so it's covered going forward. So be prepared for that kind of negotiation. Work with your legal team. Work with your subject matter experts in the area to say, hey, listen, God, I want this covered in a contract going forward. And that's liability shifting, what insurance companies are doing, and that's what they help you do. What you can absorb, what you can pay for. And if you can foist it onto someone else, a third-party vendor, you can, in theory, pay less in insurance coverage. Brian, you brought up the betterment thing. That is totally, within the last handful of years, this whole concept of betterment, a foreign concept in the insurance world, that they'll actually pay for you to get better assistance than you had before based on a breach. But they found out that it's cheaper to pay for an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If they can rectify your systems and make them more resilient or hardened, it's going to be less of a payout later. Plus, you're going to have the benefit of, when you renew a policy, to have a reduced premium because you're showing these kind of activities. And that's another post-breach, things to do after the fact. And again, I cannot stress it enough with Brian, coordinating with your service providers, coordinating with your insurance company before you start spending money. Because that is going to, the worst thing that can happen is you get to the end of it and there's $100,000 bill sitting on the table and nobody's covering that. And had you just asked the question in the beginning or said, I'm going to do this, that $100,000 bill is only 20 or 10 or not, and or maybe it's covered completely. So make sure that you are becoming that kind of traffic cop gatekeeper and coordinating with your vendors and with your insurance company. It's super important. I can't stress that enough.
Chris, as you were speaking about looking back to some of the vendor contracts or, warranties or obligations, right? You all have expressed, especially in the first series, this is an organizational conversation. And as you were speaking, right, it just made me think, definitely make sure that we're looping in those that are responsible from a procurement standpoint, right? So even if it's just through attrition, as people are replacing equipment, expanding their operations, whatever it may be, that they've got that kind of mindset or looking through that lens, which they traditionally may not be, right, for these scenarios. So, Sean, I'm going to go to you just for kind of again, not necessarily closing thoughts, but kind of looping or stitching this all together around, right? We've kind of crossed that threshold from a containment standpoint, and what we should be looking at from the do's, the don'ts, the assumptions or things that people just may not be thinking that they're going to walk into.
Yeah, no, and I've got a number of things. I took notes as I was thinking through this with the other responses, but I think again, just going back to the fact that once you get past containment, there still may be a long tail of activity that happens from a legal perspective, and that can be even months or in some cases years, even that a long tail. But around the getting past that kind of post-breach activity from a technical perspective, and what we've done from a containment, we want to, we've talked about it, reevaluate, what worked and what didn't work from an insurance policy perspective, sit down, with your providers and understand, where your gaps were, and then ultimately, address those gaps moving forward. I think the big thing for me, maybe one of the most important things is, the after action report, right? Sitting down and actually across everything, and that includes the insurance, but just as important is actually sitting down and thinking about how did the incident response plan work? Where did it fall down? Where was it? Where did it have gaps in terms of process or procedure? And making sure that we have a plan for moving forward to address those in the future, so that should we have another event, that we're in a better position than we were before. The other thing that I was thinking about is the other guys chatted here was, again, going back to the fact that there's potentially that long tail on the legal front, right? That we may incur costs very far down the road. All of that comes back to a kind of a key takeaway is your document retention, right? So this is not something where you want to just document for the sake of documenting, but you may need these explicit details months or even years down the road as part of legal proceedings and activities. So not only do you want to make sure, as you go through that you document very thoroughly, because your memory, you don't want to rely on memory, even a month later. If you're like me, my memory's like a sieve, right? It's unless it's certain numbers, I'll forget them, right? So you want to document that well, and then you need to retain that document for the duration of that, understanding that duration could be a very long period of time. So those are some of the keys from my perspective. But I really do think that after action report, that kind of sitting down and looking across all of the activities that have happened, and ensuring you really fully understand what worked and what didn't work is absolutely key.
Very good. Very good. Kind of tease up the next, right? You talked about going back. All of you have spoken about kind of going back through with the fine-tooth comb, right? And doing that review and the importance of that. And while no two incidents may be the same, right, there's definitely some similar things. We've got a few minutes left here. I'd say about 8 minutes or so. Stephen, I want to come back around to you, right, and kind of tee up the right. We wanted, again, the goal through this series, while we couldn't obviously dive into everything, this really was to be able to help people be more prepared and to maybe understand what to expect. So kind of bringing that back around to the plan, right? And in your point about being very meticulous and looking at the SLAs and improving your plan, what are some of the common things that we take it back to planning? We take it full circle back to the first event, or the first in the series, right? What are some of the common things that you see that people are, just maybe not thinking about, right? From not just an incident response standpoint. We've said many times that this is also about maintaining business continuity, right? Because some of these things that we're all seeing are bringing not just the organization itself, but their partners or communities to their knees, right? For days or weeks on end. So what are the things that you see that are being missed, and what are kind of your closing thoughts, right? You give us maybe a minute or two on kind of your closing thoughts of the life cycle that you'd want our viewers to take away as nuggets.
Sure. So, there's been a few things mentioned today that were really great. And Chris, I'm gonna reference one of them. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That really, from a technical perspective, comes down to quantifying the costs for those things ahead of time. And then in situations where you didn't understand the costs well, from a post-incident review perspective, take those costs and make sure they're captured. Make sure you're carrying those forward into conversations with your financial teams and with the leadership that are making decisions from a financial perspective in your organization. Thinking about that further, and something that a lot of executives and executive teams don't think about when it comes to this stuff, because insurance is a mechanism for addressing that financially, but there are others too. There are tax credits that you can seek as an organization making investments in your security and technology that enhance your business operations and directly map to a lot of these costs. And there's also a lot you can do from a financing perspective with the technology providers and partners that you work with that can spread the cost of this stuff out and make it more palatable and less of a cash flow issue for you as a business coming through and coming past these things. So those are great conversations to have, both before and after incidents. And those are definitely things you want to be considering, in addition to all the details that we've talked about from both a planning and response and containment perspective, as an organization looking to address these things.
Very good. Chris, any thoughts you want to share here for the next minute or two, and kind of again that whole life cycle?
Yes. So Stephen, to piggyback on what you said, and again, thank you for a segue. Both you and Brian make this easy for me. You talked about financing options and talking about how you pay for these things, making it a business decision. I tell my clients repeatedly, good cybersecurity hygiene is like good accounting practices. Both can enhance your business if they're done well, and if done poorly, they can damage your business beyond belief. But, interestingly enough, Stephen, you brought up a point about options you have to kind of alleviate some of the high upfront costs of being a conversation you have to have with the finance teams. But something else is from the legal side is understanding your vendor contracts. I'm coming back to that again, because when you look at your vendor contracts, there are ways to shift expenses. You're paying for cloud-based storage. Well, guess what? If you're going to pay $1,000 a month for cloud-based storage and it has all of these different security features, or you're going to pay $1,000 a month and it doesn't have all these security features, guess what? I'm obviously going to tell you to go with the one that you're getting all the security features with, because that is a way you can shift some of the cost and expense for security, for hardening of your network, to a third party. And now you're going to pay the $1,000 a month anyway. Might as well get some bonus and benefit with it that you don't have to pay on top of the $1,000 with the lesser grade services, and go forward. So making sure you're having that discussion. It is a holistic approach. It is everyone, like an accounting practice, everyone needs to be on board, and everyone needs to have this conversation. A breach is not an if, it's a when kind of statement. We all know that. No one on this call in this Zoom is going to argue with that at all. But we're all going to say, listen, if I can advise you from a legal standpoint to use your contracts, use your vendors as ways to mediate costs, whether it's insurance, whether it's service providers, whether it's just services you're buying or hardware you're buying, make sure those contracts have language that help protect you. It's inexpensive insurance that is helpful. You're going to pay for it anyway. Might as well get the most bang for your buck. So there's a simple one. Simple takeaway.
Brian, closing thoughts.
Yeah, a couple things. I think people need to have a little bit of humility that this is a big widespread thing that's it's evolving faster than we're all trying to keep up. So I think having some humility when deciding where to spend money, whether with Steve or with Chris or with Apex or even on an insurance policy, I think the tendency still has been it won't happen or it can't happen. I just think having some of that would be helpful. Also listening to the providers that you work with, that all of us are trying to help. And the last thing that I would encourage business owners to think about is we talked a lot about the internal expenses and liabilities and things to consider, but Jason, you teed this up pretty well. There's a whole interconnected business world that we're all part of. That's partners, that's customers, that's a community, that's there's suppliers, vendors. You also have to think about who you're dependent on for business, and if they suffer a breach, what do you do? If there's a significant customer of yours and there's a cyber attack on them, there are ways to buy insurance for that. There are ways to mitigate around that. Additionally, if there's a key supplier and they have a breach, so there's a bigger ecosystem that leaves businesses vulnerable. And Chris alluded to that on some of the agreements, but think about the vulnerabilities there and try to transfer, mitigate, or insure that risk.
Well, I think it's a great segue over to Sean. I'll tee this up a little bit, right? I shared the stat that they expect by the end of 2021 that a malicious attack will occur, successful malicious attack will occur every 11 seconds, right? That's triple last year. And with the mandates, the supply chain, and what we've seen over these past several weeks or a couple of weeks with Colonial Pipeline. Sean, kind of closing thoughts, and I'll say a little bit of maybe what you see in the crystal ball around potential requirements coming down in mandates that maybe weren't there for certain industries or organizations. So would you give us your thoughts around that as we close out here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, we've mentioned it multiple times, right? At the end of the day, breach is inevitable, right? It's how much we plan and prepare for it will dictate whether this is a significant life-changing type of or business impacting type of event, or if this is momentary pain, where we have to deal with it, but we have the systems and the processes in place. So it is all around preparation and the point of humility, understanding that these things will happen, and it is inevitable. Jason, you mentioned the activity. It's been a whirlwind last couple of weeks with a lot of activity, a lot of front page headlines, in particular the pipeline attack, and as we're looking at how our infrastructure is changing on a daily basis, and the transformation to the cloud, the introduction of IoT devices everywhere, whether that's within our businesses or within our personal lives, they're everywhere. And the reality is that it just changes that attack surface level, which leads to the greater number of breaches and the higher frequency of those. In terms of the crystal ball, what I can't say for sure is exactly what might be coming. We all know that if anything, we know that it's going to constantly change, and there's going to continue to be more and more pressure. I think we talked about it. I think was it Brian, you or maybe Chris mentioned the number of states that have privacy laws. There's the team being put together by our government right now to look at cybersecurity more broadly. I would expect to see activities coming out of that, and certainly around not just our critical infrastructure as a country, but even beyond. Right, all of these things are interconnected. We're all part of a broader community that way. So I would expect to see continued regulatory pressure, continued increase in pressure from our customers and our partners in terms of legal language and liability language within our contracts, and continued push on our budgets to ensure that we're doing the right things and we're proactive about these things. And that's just a reality that we all face as individuals, but as businesses as well.
Well, I appreciate that right there, and definitely it's coming up in topics of discussion more and more. I think it's been interesting, right? I think Stephen in the first part had said, hey, the critical part of the critical first step is having the conversation, and not only having that conversation internally, but obviously respecting confidentiality and PR and those things. I think it's important that we just as a community, right, on the good side of all of this, continue to have that conversation amongst our peers with providers, because until you've been through it, right, and we've all together been through assisting customers with these types of things, you don't really know, right, until you've kind of gone through it. So speak with those that have. Again, everything's going to be a little bit different scenario to scenario. But just to encourage the conversation. We'll continue to release some content, some blogs, and definitely appreciate everybody's time and expertise over these past 3 webinars that we've done. And to our viewers out there, thank you again for joining us. Hope you found it valuable, and please definitely feel free to reach out if there's any follow-up questions. So thank you, everyone.